The 1950 World Cup is one of the most incredible of all time. If you want to see more football history videos like these, please drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. With the Second World War starting in 1939, there hadn't been a World Cup since Italy's triumph in France in 1938. There was an attempt to have a World Cup in 1942, hosted by either Germany, Brazil or Argentina, but, well, a World Cup during the middle of the Second World War? Yeah, sounds like a great idea. No, obviously nothing came of it. But as the Second World War came to a close, large portions of Europe had been decimated, and with morale at an all-time low, the need for any sort of entertainment after the trauma caused by the conflict was at an all-time high. The problem was, due to the damage caused by the Second World War, most countries didn't deem it economically sensible to host a World Cup post-war, even 5 years after the official end of the conflict. There was in fact an early consideration for Switzerland, the home of FIFA, to host the next World Cup, but they just simply lacked the facilities. Moreover, handing the hosting rights to another European nation would likely see more boycotts from South American nations, which is what we saw in 1938. In order to avoid more boycotts, FIFA handed the hosting rights to the only South American nation, and really, to be honest, the only nation looking to properly host: Brazil. Originally, 1949 was the selected year for the World Cup, but in order to give Brazil more time to prepare, FIFA pushed the date back another year. Brazil was growing extremely fast as a footballing nation, and they even had the stadiums to host, including the impressive Maracanazo stadium, which was able to hold 200,000 people and would be ready for the World Cup. So they said. Overall, 34 nations attempted to qualify. However, much like qualification stages prior, it was full of nations saying, yeah, we'll play.
Not.
As host, Brazil automatically qualified, as did Italy, who, although there hadn't been a World Cup for 12 years, were still the current holders. Now, starting in Europe, there was one group of 2, 4 groups of 3, and one group of 4. The group of 4 was in fact the British Home Championships. The home nations rejoined FIFA in 1946, and it was decided that the championship would decide who'd qualify for the World Cup, with first and second place qualifying. Israel and Syria were also involved in qualifying. West Germany were unable to take part, as was East Germany, who wouldn't join FIFA for another couple of years. Finally, most nations behind the Iron Curtain, including the USSR, Czechoslovakia and the 1938 finalist Hungary, refused to take part. So, starting with the first group, the British Home Championship. England and Scotland finished comfortably as the top 2, qualifying for the World Cup. But before the tournament, the SFA Secretary George Graham said that if Scotland finished second in their group, they wouldn't go to the World Cup. And he stuck to his guns. In the final game of the group, England beat Scotland 1-0 at Hampden Park, finishing top of the group, and Scotland didn't go. Scotland, it's fine. You will play millions of World Cups after, don't worry. Now it's time to get unnecessarily complicated. In 3 of the 4 groups of 3, the 2 worst teams would go head to head, and the winners would advance to face the group seeded side. So in Group 2, Turkey beat Syria 7-0, leading to a match against Austria. But Austria withdrew, and Turkey would have qualified for the World Cup if they didn't withdraw as well. In Group 3, Olympic silver medalist Yugoslavia faced Israel and beat them 11-2 across the 2 games, going on to face France to decide who would go to Brazil. After drawing their 2 games, Yugoslavia beat Le Bleu in a replay, securing qualification. However, this isn't the last we'd speak of France. Finally, in Group 4, Switzerland beat Luxembourg 8-4 on aggregate and went on to face Belgium. Belgium withdrew before their games could be played, and Switzerland automatically qualified. In Group 5, Sweden didn't even need to play all of their games to secure qualification. And in Group 6, Spain beat Portugal 7-3 on aggregate, securing qualification for a second time. Portugal were offered Turkey's spot, but they declined, and the spot was eventually given to France. In South America, there was one group of 3 and one group of 4, with the top 2 from each group going through. The group of 3 consisted of Argentina, Bolivia and Chile. Argentina withdrew, citing a disagreement with the Brazilian Confederation, meaning without kicking a ball, Bolivia and Chile had qualified. The group of 4 involved Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru and Uruguay. Ecuador and Peru withdrew, meaning Paraguay and Uruguay also qualified without kicking a ball. In North and Central America, the 1949 NAFC Championship would decide who'd go through out of Cuba, Mexico and the USA. The latter 2 went through, with Mexico absolutely dominating. Finally, in Group 10, Burma, now Myanmar, Indonesia and the Philippines all withdrew, meaning the spot was given to India, who would play in the World Cup for the very first time. So, the teams in the 1950 World Cup were as follows: Brazil, Italy, England, Yugoslavia, France, Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, Bolivia, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Mexico, USA, and India. A new format was introduced for the 1950 World Cup. After a 20-year exile, the group stages returned and there were no knockout stages. Instead, the winners of each group would meet in a final group, play each other once, and the winner of that group would win the newly christened Jules Rimet Cup. For the sake of the video, I'm going to keep on referring to it as the World Cup. So, Group 1 consisted of host Brazil, Mexico, Switzerland, and Yugoslavia. Switzerland had Alfred Bickel in their side, who, alongside Swede Erik Nielsen, was one of only 2 players to play in pre- and post-war World Cups. Brazil came into this World Cup as massive favourites. Under the management of Flavio Costa and his tweaking of the WM, known as the diagonal, the Copa America champions had scored 58 goals in their previous 13 games. The WM was introduced to Brazilians by Gentile Cardoso, but popularised by Hungarian Dori Kirchner. However, innovative as it was, the WM was deemed too defensive by Brazilian standards. When Kirchner was sacked by Flamengo, his assistant, Flavio Costa, who was completely opposed to the WM, created the diagonal. Here's the concept. Tilt the midfield into a parallelogram, making one side of the midfield deeper than the other. On that deep side, bring one of the fullbacks higher up the pitch, thus helping the winger ahead of him. Meanwhile, the halfback ahead could move into the fullback slot. But the best of all, the formation could be flipped. One side could be progressive and one could be regressive. It didn't matter which. Their magic triangle of Ademir, Jair and star player Zizinho would be vital in their efforts to win the World Cup. According to Pelé, who idolised Zizinho, he was a complete player. He played in midfield, in attack, he scored goals, he could mark, head and cross. Although the construction of the Maracanazo wasn't quite complete, the opening game between Brazil and Mexico would still take place in the famous stadium, but just with a reduced capacity of 81,000. In the group's opening games, Brazil and Yugoslavia romped to 3 and 4-0 wins respectively. However, a surprise draw for Brazil against Switzerland and a 4-1 win for Yugoslavia against Mexico meant that the hosts needed a win against Yugoslavia to qualify for the final group. In front of an extended crowd of 142,000, because the stadium still wasn't complete, Ademir gave Brazil the lead. However, for the first 20 minutes, Yugoslavia were down to 10 men as their captain Ratko Mitic hit his head on a metal lid and he had to miss the start of the game. When he made his way back onto the pitch, he had no idea what the score was, only finding out that they were 1-0 down at half-time. Zizinho, who missed the first 2 games due to injury, made it 2-0 in the second half, and Brazil qualified for the final group. Group 2 comprised of Chile, England, Spain, and the USA, who were a genuine bunch of amateurs with daytime jobs. Some notable players in this group include Spanish striker Telmo Zarra. An incredible goalscorer, Zarra has 2 trophies named after him, given to the highest scoring Spaniards in La Liga and the Segunda Division. Zarra scored 251 La Liga goals in his career, a record he'd hold for 59 years. I'll let you figure out which 2 players beat his record. The England squad had Stan Mortensen, an incredible striker himself. He scored a hat-trick in the 1953 FA Cup final. A final that will forever be named after Stanley Matthews. You've got to feel bad for Mortensen there. Matthews, the first Ballon d'Or winner, was actually in the squad and at age 35 had 15 more years of football in him. However, he barely played in this World Cup, as he and other internationals had to take a meaningless trip to Canada before, only arriving in Brazil after England's first game. Also in this side was their captain, Billy Wright, the first player ever to reach 100 international caps, Bill Nicholson, who managed Tottenham to their last league title in 1961, and Alf Ramsey. More about him in the future. Yet, the 3 Lions were without arguably their best defender, Neil Franklin, who had turned down a place in the squad to go and play in Colombia's infamous El Dorado League for Independiente Santa Fe. Chile had the only player in the squad who played their club football for a foreign team. That player was George Robledo, who was playing for Newcastle United, and 2 years later in 1952 would score the winning goal in the FA Cup final. In the first round of fixtures, England beat Chile 2-0 in a difficult match, and Spain beat the USA 3-1, despite being 1-0 down for the majority of the game. Spain then beat Chile 2-0 in Rio. However, 340 kilometres north in Belo Horizonte, England suffered a defeat to the USA that shocked the world. England's post-war record of 23 wins, 3 draws and 4 losses was one of the best, whereas the USA's record of 3 wins, 1 draw and 13 losses after the 1930 World Cup was awful. These defeats included conceding 6 or more to Mexico 4 times, a 7-1 defeat to Italy, and an 11-0 defeat to Norway. A chunk of their players weren't even US citizens, and as I said earlier, they were a bunch of amateurs. It would be fair to give the US 3 goals of a start, wrote the Daily Express. What could possibly go wrong? According to FIFA, England annihilated their opponents, creating no fewer than 6 chances inside the first 12 minutes. Alongside the woodwork, goalkeeper and hearse driver Frank Borghi was seemingly the only thing that could stop England. The US took the lead through Haitian-born Joe Gaetjens. One of 3 non-US citizens in the side, Gaetjens' goal was either a brilliant header or a lucky deflection. As a bitter Englishman, I'm gonna go with the latter. So incredible was the result, the Americans were heroically carried off by the Brazilian fans in attendance. It was the greatest result in US World Cup history so far, whereas for England, none have ever been more embarrassing. Embarrassing as it was, England was still in with a chance of qualifying. With Spain's victory over Chile, England had to beat the Spaniards in order to force a playoff. According to historian Norman Giller, England played their best football of the finals against Spain, but their finishing left a lot to be desired. The great Zara scored the game's only goal, sending Spain into the final group alongside Brazil. Group 3 is legitimately one of the most interesting in the entire history of the competition. Let's start off with the elephant in the room, India. India no-showed the tournament, and there are 2 differing opinions as to why. According to FIFA, India wanted to play barefoot like they had done in the Olympics, which wasn't allowed in FIFA competitions. Or there's India's reasoning of valuing the Olympics over the World Cup, which was pretty common at the time, and not being keen on the travel costs, although FIFA did agree to fund most of it. Either way, they didn't show up, meaning there were only 3 teams in this group. Paraguay were Copa America runners-up in 1949. Legitimately a very good side, Paraguay had hit a patchy run of form just after the Copa America final, possibly the worst timing. Sweden were Olympic champions. A phenomenal side managed by George Reyna, Sweden played with a lot of attacking flair. But they had a problem. If you wanted to play for Sweden, you had to be an amateur footballer. This meant they missed out on playing Gunnar Andersson, Bertil Nordhall, Henry Carlson, Gunnar Nordhall, Gunnar Gren, and Nils Lidholm. These were legitimately world-class players playing for Marseille, Atalanta, Atletico Madrid, and the great gre-no-li trio were killing it at Milan, as they had just scored 71 goals in the league between them. But despite missing a lot of their players, they still had a decent chance of progressing. However, it was for a tragic reason. Torino were the pride of Italian football in the mid to late 40s. From 1946 to 1949, they had won all 4 Serie A titles, and a large proportion of their side represented the Azzurri, including starman Valentino Mazzola. On the 27th of February and the 27th of March in 1949, Italy made short work of Portugal and Spain, with 8 Torino players representing the Azzurri. However, on the 4th of May, just over 1 month later, all 8 of those players and 23 other passengers, including Torino players and staff, tragically perished in the Superga air disaster. The national side had been decimated, morale was low, and the decision to understandably take a 2-week boat trip to Brazil as opposed to flying made preparations difficult. Preparations, however, differ on who you ask. Egisto Pandolfini said, "We took 50 balls with us, they all ended up in the sea." But Roma legend Amadeo Amadei said that was tutto falso. The first game of the group pitted Sweden against Italy, and in what was a back and forth game, a Hans Jepsen brace gave Sweden the win. On his ability, Jepsen said, "I can't play football, but I can score goals." So basically Cristiano Ronaldo from the age of 30. Incredibly, this was Italy's first ever World Cup loss. And it was a lovely bit of irony, with Sweden beating the nation that paid their best professional players. Now, because there were only 3 teams in this group, Sweden also played the next game, this time against Paraguay. They drew 2-2, after Paraguay equalised in the 89th minute, meaning if Paraguay could beat Italy, they would require a playoff against Sweden to decide who finished top. Italy beat them 2-0, with Pandolfini scoring the second, showing that those 50 imaginary footballs did the trick. Sweden progressed, joining Brazil and Spain in the final group. Now it's time for the funniest group of them all, Group 4. When this group was drawn and had Bolivia, France and Uruguay down to play each other, how many games do you reckon were played in this group? Well, if you said 1, you would be correct. After the draw was made, France withdrew from the competition entirely, citing travelling costs between venues. So, Uruguay versus Bolivia was the only game from this group. It was a close game. For 14 minutes. Yeah, Uruguay won a joint record 8-0, and Oscar Miguel scored the first hat-trick of this World Cup. And with that, the final group was set. One of Brazil, Spain, Sweden or Uruguay would be crowned as champions of the world. Right, I'm going to be honest with everyone watching this video. Brazil take the absolute out of this group. Adamir himself scored 6 goals combined in this group in 6 and 7-1 wins over Spain and Sweden. Famous English writer Brian Glanville called it the football from the future. Tactically unexceptional, but technically superb. Uruguay, on the other hand, were involved in more dramatic games of football. Against Spain, they'd go 2-1 down until captain Obdulio Varela equalised, and against Sweden, they were 2-1 down with 13 minutes to go. However, Oscar Miguez clutched up big time. Scoring twice in 8 minutes, Miguez gave La Celeste a 3-2 win, sending them into the final group game against Brazil with a chance to win the World Cup. They had to win, whereas Brazil only required a draw. It was a small chance, but it was a chance. On the 16th of July in Sao Paulo, Sweden beat Spain 3-1 in the de facto third place playoff, and such was the quality of their performances, a load of Sweden's players moved abroad after this World Cup. In fact, 10 of their 21-man squad played in Italy within a year. Some even had really successful spells, including Bror Malberg at Genoa. But the two that truly stand out were Lennart Skoglund and Hans Jepsen. Skoglund signed for Inter, and his career started off about as well as it possibly could, when, in only his second game for the Nerazzurri, he scored a brace, including the winning goal in the Derby della Madonnina. In the Milan side that day, his fellow Swedes, the gre-no-li trio, and Buffon, not that one, Lorenzo Buffon, who is a distant relative of Gianluigi. Combining incredibly well with goal machines Hungarian István Nyers and Italian Benito Lorenzi, Skoglund won 2 Scudetto in his 9 years at the club. However, with his increasing celebrity status came the rise of alcoholism, which led to his untimely death in 1975, aged 45. After his death, Skoglund's mother came out with one of the saddest quotes I've ever heard about a person. Lennart had no real friends, not even during his successful years. He was the loneliest man in the world. The story of Hans Jepsen is equally as fascinating. Jepsen played one more season in Sweden, ending the campaign as the league's top scorer for Djurgårdens, before making the move to Charlton Athletic in England. The Addicts was second from bottom when Jepsen made his full debut in mid-January, and his impact on the team was nothing short of breathtaking. After scoring a last-minute winner against bottom-of-the-table Sheffield Wednesday on his debut, Jepsen scored against Liverpool, Chelsea, Wolves, Stoke City, and even scored a hat-trick against Arsenal. Jepsen only played 11 games for the London side, however his 9 goals catapulted them to mid-table by April, and they survived comfortably. A move to Atalanta in Serie A swiftly followed, ending his only season there on 22 goals. This included a phenomenal 15 goals in his final 13 games, and it led to a move to Napoli for a world record transfer of 105 million lira. Given the nickname the Bank of Naples, Jepsen enjoyed his time at Napoli, scoring 52 goals in his 4 seasons there. 1 season at Torino followed before retiring from the game completely. However, because of his professional status, Jepsen never played for Sweden ever again after this World Cup. Okay, short tangent over. The game everyone wanted to see was happening on the same day as Spain versus Sweden, in Rio, in front of an estimated world record crowd of 200,000 people. If Brazil could just draw this one game against Uruguay, they would be world champions for the first time ever. In order for Uruguay to be champions of the world for a second time, they had to win. Because of touts buying them in bulk, tickets for the final sold out rapidly. This led to mini riots where the tickets were being sold, and the police took action by seizing 14,000 of them, and then they were sold at face value. Every Brazilian had to be at this game because in their minds it was a foregone conclusion. Brazil were going to be world champions. Before the game, 22 gold medals were made specifically for the Brazilian squad, and a victory song called Brazil the Victors was composed and ready to play after the game. On the day of the game, in an edition of O Mundo, read the headline, "These are the world champions," above a picture of the Brazilian team. Also, the mayor of Rio, Angelo Mendes de Moraes, read out a speech proclaiming Brazil as champions of the world. You players, who in less than a few hours will be hailed as champions by millions of compatriots, you who have no rivals in the entire hemisphere, you who will overcome any competitor, you who I already salute as victors. However, one man was a bit uneasy, the manager, Flavio Costa. I'm afraid that my players will take the field on Sunday as though they already had the championship shield on their jerseys. Tactically, Costa made a huge and strange call as he played the WM instead of the diagonal. Uruguay were outraged at the overconfidence of the Brazilian people. Captain Varela bought as many copies of El Mundo as he could, threw them onto his bathroom floor, and joined in with his teammates on spitting and urinating on them. Varela's incredibly strong mentality and phenomenal leadership skills cannot be understated during this World Cup. Uruguay played the 1-3-3-3 formation, taking inspiration from Carapan's Veru in an attempt to stifle the Brazilian attack. When Varela was alone with his players, he told them to bin off the tactics, that if they played defensive, they'd get destroyed, and to go out with no intimidation or fear. Go out calmly, do not look up, never look at the stands. The match is played below, said Varela. According to Alcides Gigia, who'd scored 3 goals in the World Cup for Uruguay so far, said that 3 people from the Uruguayan FA spoke to Varela, goalkeeper Roque Maspoli, and defender Schubert Gambetta the night before. They told him that their objectives had been complete, for them to stay out of any trouble, and that losing by 3 or 4 goals to Brazil was more than okay. However, before kickoff, Varela told his players about it and stated that people off the field don't matter, they don't play the game. The referee for this match was Englishman George Reeder, and this was by no mean a coincidence. Reeder had refereed Brazil's first game, a 4-0 win against Mexico, and he impressed a lot of people. Spaniard Ramon Roma took charge of their second game, a 2-2 draw against Switzerland, and he received a lot of criticism. You see, back then, British referees were just considered the best. Oh, how times have changed. To understand just how highly rated they were, 5 of the referees in this World Cup were British, and a Brazilian newspaper wrote the following. We must strongly demand that Brazil shall not take the field again in this World Championship if a British referee is not in charge. Even should we finally meet the English, we shall still demand a British referee and have full confidence in him. Realistically, however, Costa making widespread changes, including bringing in 3 Sao Paulo players to impress the locals, and Switzerland's Veru formation, played a larger impact in the game. After that Switzerland game, every Brazil game in this World Cup was refereed by a Brit. The players entered the pitch, ready for a 3 PM kickoff in front of a world record incredibly hostile and atmospheric 200,000 people. It was estimated that only 100 of these fans were Uruguayan. Such was the magnitude of the game and the atmosphere surrounding it, Uruguayan forward Julio Perez wet himself during the national anthem. Yet, once all the pomp and circumstance surrounding the game had finished and the game had kicked off, it seemingly kicked into the minds of Brazilians that they still had to get a result, and as the first half went on, the pressure was mounting. Brazil still did control the first half, however. Uruguay's defensive tactics likely tamed the Brazilian attack, but it certainly didn't neutralise it. Varela, Andrade and goalkeeper Maspoli were being tested heavily, Uruguay even hit the post, but the referee blew for the halftime whistle, and the score was still 0-0. Yet, as the second half kicked off, the scoreline wouldn't remain 0-0 for very long, as Ademir played in Sao Paulo forward Friasa, who scored his first and only international goal. Brazil 1, Uruguay 0, and the belief was the floodgates would open. But this was a Uruguay side that would not bow down to pressure, and they had Varela to thank for it. During the celebrations, the captain complained to Reeder, who was multilingual. Not that he thought there was anything wrong with the goal, but it gave the crowd a chance to settle down, and the atmosphere dampened. We either kick up a fuss or they will kill us, he screamed at Gigia. Although mostly on the back foot in the first half, Uruguay found joy against Bigold on the left side of Brazil's defence. So they continued to attack that area, and they eventually got the goal that they required. Gigia skipped past Bigold, who crossed in low for Juan Scafino, who buried his chance. The Maracanazo was stunned into silence. The pressure that had been lifted after Friasa's goal was slammed back down onto the players. They couldn't cope, and with 11 minutes remaining, the unthinkable happened. After making a fool of Bigold once again, Gigia's bobbling shot found its way past Barbosa in the Brazilian goal. Brazil had no reply, and with that, Uruguay were 2-time champions of the world. Brazil were not meant to lose this game. They had this win in the bag even before kickoff, but fate had other ideas. Uruguay had done the unthinkable and produced one of the biggest shocks in World Cup history. In an attempt to stop any potential violence, the trophy presentation was basically non-existent. The silence was morbid, sometimes too difficult to bear, told Jules Rimet, who was there to present the trophy named after himself. Uruguay captain Obdulio Varela, whose impact on this game was quite simply remarkable, said, "Most people thought that we were done for, that we did not stand a chance. The more I think about all that, the more I'm sure that was a match that we won with our minds, not based on skill." Unsurprisingly, the result was taken badly. Really badly. There was uncontrollable crying in the stadium, multiple suicides were reported as a result of the game, and even during the celebrations in Montevideo, violence broke out, resulting in 8 casualties. The top scorer, Ademir, couldn't take the result. "As soon as I could, I went away in my car and just kept driving. I ended up going to Itacarusa, that's an island not far away from Rio de Janeiro, and I just stayed there for 15 days after the match. In reality, I just had to get away from everybody. Brazilian playwright Nelson Rodrigues wrote, "Everywhere has its irremediable national catastrophe, something like a Hiroshima. Our catastrophe, our Hiroshima, was the defeat by Uruguay in 1950. So with that, the 1950 World Cup was done. There were 88 goals, the highest amount so far, with Brazil scoring over a quarter of them, and Ademir top scored with a record 9 goals. But now I'm going to leave you with one of the coldest quotes in football history from Alcides Gigia, scorer of Uruguay's second goal against Brazil. When you look down through history, only 3 men have ever silenced the Maracanazo: the Pope, Frank Sinatra, and me."